Hello and welcome to this side-by-side debate between Karl Marx and QAnon. In the spirit of the marketplace of ideas, I will not be introducing myself, nor will I introduce Karl Marx or Q. My plan is to lay out their ideas side by side in 3 rounds. Round 1, Theory of History. Round 2, What's Wrong with Today's World. And Round 3, Current Events. Most importantly, I will not declare a winner. Instead, I will try to describe each worldview as faithfully as I can by using the primary sources. Yes, I have read both the writings of Karl Marx and the posts of QAnon. Not sure how many people read both of them, but I have, and I'm here to line up each of the ideas right next to each other. I'll leave it up to you, the viewer, to decide which worldview you find more compelling. So without further introduction, let's begin with round 1 by working from left to right. Round 1, Theory of History, Karl Marx. For those of you who enjoy doing your own research, my overall summary here is going to rely heavily on part 1 of the German ideology, and we'll be moving at a rapid pace. So, Karl Marx centers human history on human needs. Before anyone can learn a religion or join a political party, they have basic needs: food, water, shelter, sometimes clothing. He then characterizes different ages in history by how these goods are produced. For example, think of how transportation has changed dramatically over the years. In colonial America, you might take a horse-drawn carriage. Nowadays, you drive a car. But this change is not just about getting from point A to point B slightly faster. Instead, it creates an entirely different society. Industries open up for car dealerships, mechanics, and construction workers. Since you can travel greater distances in faster time, your options for employers and vacation changes. Overall, society completely reshapes itself. Marx would say that men not only produce cloth, linen, and silk, but also produce the social relations amid which they prepare cloth and linen. So let's explore how Marx sketches out history around the means of production. First, he points to tribal ownership. Early humans grouped together along family ties. The division of labor is pretty minimal. A hunter generally knows every step involved in hunting, including how to make their own weapons, how to track the animals, how to cook the animals, and how to make use of leftover bones and hides. The same applies to people fishing, raising livestock, farming, and everything else. At a micro level, society is organized around the family, and at a macro level, society is organized around the family. The chief basically acts as a parent to the tribe, a family of families. At the bottom you have slaves, which are typically people conquered in battle who now have to serve the tribe. Over time, the population grows. Soon, tribes start coming into contact, either making war or forming alliances. Eventually, a shift occurs. A group of tribes combine to form a city. The creation of a city creates its own set of distinctions. Now there's a difference between town and country. Tribal members shift away from tribal lands and start staking out private property. These citizens, and here Marx is very much thinking about Rome, are now able to work their private property or make their slaves work it for them. In turn, they grow more food, build aqueducts, conduct trade, and are all around more productive. But the Roman way of doing things carries the seeds of its own destruction. The city must journey further and further out into the country to satisfy its need for slaves and conquest. In response, the Germanic tribes organize a resistance that will lay the groundwork for feudal Europe. When Rome finally overextends itself, the Germanic tribes fill the power vacuum by reorganizing society along the lines of feudal or estate property. Slaves transition to serfs now tied to the land. Since the country estates are growing all of the food, the power in society rests in the country and by extension, the feudal lords with the military might to control production. As the power in the country grows, the power in the town weakens, but over time new possibilities start to open up. Skilled craftsmen form guilds, in part to keep unskilled free serfs out of the way. The productiveness of the guilds adds a further boost to trade and finance. An important break occurs between commerce and production, meaning the guilds make the goods, while separate groups of bankers and merchants form to trade the goods. As always, humans continue to innovate and develop better techniques for farming. Increases in productivity mean that more and more serfs can be freed. These serfs start to concentrate in cities, where the only thing they have to sell is their labor. This is an important shift. In the old guild system, an apprentice trained to be a journeyman who trained to be a master. And these people in the guild system either did, or at least understood, every step in the process of producing their goods. In this new world, we have manufacturers. Manufacturing is outside of the guild system. Instead of training to be a craftsman, people will start to sell their time to do a set of tasks for a wage. Weaving is the first one that Marx points to. Manufacturing really starts to increase their productivity with the division of labor. More productivity means more trade. More trade spurs innovations in finance such as paper money, national debts, and more professional banking. These improvements help pave the way for exploration as merchants seek out new markets and new trading opportunities. New markets entice the capitalists to start more factories, which further divide up labor as they compete to become even more productive. The whole system constantly feeds back into itself and becomes increasingly interwoven, increasingly productive. As capitalism ramps up, more and more power shifts away from the country, where the nobility control landed property. In this new era, power moves to the towns, where the capitalists control labor. The capitalists buy the labor time of the workers in exchange for the goods the workers make. It's important to keep in mind how an earlier society always contains the seeds of the next society. In Capital Volume 1, Marx writes, "The economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former." This leads to the emergence of the modern state, and here Marx is very much thinking about the United States of America, especially the early United States. Power had shifted away from the King of England and towards a group of merchants and businessmen who began to recognize themselves as a distinct class, separate from the old nobility. As a result, they fought a revolution and reorganized the state around their values, protecting private property, facilitating commerce, respecting privacy, and generally safeguarding the right to be left alone. Once the capitalists overthrow the old aristocracy, the stage is set for a new conflict, the conflict between capitalist and worker. And we'll pick back up with this tension in round 2. Let's close out Marx's round by clarifying some misconceptions. First, a lazy definition of capitalist might be something like rich or wealthy. In the context of Marx, this is not true. An ancient priest, a Japanese warlord, and a famous social media influencer might all be considered wealthy relative to their historical time period. That does not mean that they're capitalists. This term is reserved for people who control the means of production. Second, not everything is a class conflict. People who misunderstand Marx might throw the phrase around whenever two groups don't like each other: a Roman citizen versus Germanic tribe, guild system versus serf, white versus black. None of these are class conflicts for Marx. Class conflict arises between capitalist and worker as the two organize around their separate and competing relationships to the means of production. Again, we'll explore this more in round 2. The key point here is that Marx builds his history around how people produce the things they need to live. Changes in how people produce goods, especially through changes in technology, will reverberate throughout society, often leading a new group of people to emerge as the dominant power. Round 1, Theory of History, QAnon. The QAnon movement presents a very different view of history. Now, before I get started, I should add a caveat. There is a Q post stating outright, quote, "You can count the people who have the full picture on 2 hands. Of those less than 10 people, only 3 are non-military." I'll say up front that I am not one of those 10 people. I'm just trying to summarize the broad strokes of what Q is trying to communicate. To keep some of the flavor of Q, I'll also try to present this as a process of discovery and use a chess metaphor, because Q loves to reference chess games. In that spirit, the first posts are about setting up the players and putting the pieces on the board. Posts 2 and 15 set up the opposing sides. The good guys on one side include Donald Trump, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and a group of insiders nicknamed the, quote, Wizards and Warlocks. On the other side, there's a mysterious group of families. These families live in the shadows and control many of the world's politicians. Quote, "The Wizards and Warlocks, inside term, will not allow another satanic evil POS control our country. Realize Soros, Clintons, Obama, Putin, etc. are all controlled by 3 families. The 4th was removed post-Trump's victory." Posts 3, 10, and 29 all reinforce the satanic worship and how children are being abducted for use in evil child rituals. However, the good guys, led by Trump, are fighting back in the global chess game. Quote, "The pedo networks are being dismantled. The child abductions for satanic rituals, i.e. Haiti and other third world countries, are paused, not terminated until players in custody." Post 153 even specifies Moloch, the Canaanite god of child sacrifice. Everything starts to fit together in post 34, which I read as something of a thesis statement. Q is introduced as a Q clearance patriot, referring to the security clearance at the Department of Energy, writing, quote, "My fellow Americans, over the course of the next several days, you will undoubtedly realize that we are taking back our great country, the land of the free, from the evil tyrants that wish to do us harm and destroy the last remaining refuge of shining light. On POTUS's order, we have initiated certain fail-safes that shall safeguard the public from the primary fallout which is slated to occur November 3rd upon the arrest announcement of Mr. Podesta, actionable November 4th. Confirmation to the public of what is occurring will then be revealed and will not be openly accepted." So far, we've laid out a few key dynamics. 1. At some point, a group of evil families took control of the world's governments and are using that power to kidnap children and worship Satan. 2. Donald Trump and a group of patriots, sometimes called the Wizards and Warlocks, are leading a shadow war against the Satanists. We'll explore the second point in round 2. For now, let's focus on the first point. After all, round 1 is titled Theory of History. So let's ask the question, how far back does this evil plot extend? How far into the past did the deep state start on their journey to power? A large number of Q posts will explore the roots of the deep state, and there are volumes of secondary literature and videos adding to the depth and breadth of the deep state. I won't be able to cover all of it in this video, but I can at least give you a glimpse. Posts 119 and 133 give more background on the three families that form the backbone of the deep state. Those families are the House of Saud, Rothschilds, and Soros families. Let me pull in some outside information to provide background on those families, because Q often writes with an assumption that you'll do your own research. The House of Saud traces its history in the Arabian Peninsula back to the earliest records of human civilization. Of course, they weren't major players on the world stage for all that time, but key moments for them occurred with the creation of the first Saudi state in the early 18th century, the second Saudi state, which was mired in fighting with the Ottomans, and eventually the creation of the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. This kingdom was led by King Abdulaziz, who galvanized the country's rapid push towards modernization. His successors continued that project through the 20th century and on to today. The Rothschild family, at least as far as it's concerned with banking, dates back to Meyer Amschel Rothschild, who was born in 1744 in Frankfurt, Germany's Jewish ghetto. His parents died tragically of smallpox, leaving him an orphan at the age of 12. He caught his break when he was able to take an apprenticeship with a banking firm. Rothschild worked up in the banking world to become the banker for some of Europe's wealthiest nobles, including the wealthiest, Wilhelm IX Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. With these connections, the nobles would rely on the Rothschilds to help finance various wars in Europe. In terms of his family, Meyer did everything he could to create a consolidated banking dynasty that would keep wealth within the family. Post 1021 also mentions the Rothschild loan to the Vatican, which helps to establish the Vatican's connection to the forces of evil. Finally, George Soros was born George Schwartz in Budapest, Hungary in 1930. Their father changed their family name after being taken prisoner in World War I and successfully escaping Russia. Still a child, George would help his father forge documents to help their countrymen flee the Holocaust. George would survive, study at the London School of Economics, and move to the United States to work on Wall Street. Over the years, he became enormously wealthy as a hedge fund manager. Consider these summaries quick sketches of the three families that we're going to layer much more on top of. Post 782, which I consider to be a landmark QAnon post, seems to carry an endorsement of the book Behold a Pale Horse by Milton William Cooper. This book famously starts with the Illuminati's declaration of war upon the people of America, a document that, according to Cooper, was found in an IBM copier that was purchased at a surplus sale. In the book, Bill Cooper draws connections between the Illuminati, Bilderberger Group, and possibly extraterrestrials. The extraterrestrials even made a secret alliance with President Eisenhower, but they eventually broke it and have been misleading presidents ever since. So putting the pieces back together, the three families of the deep state, Saud, Rothschild, and Soros, linked up, possibly with extraterrestrials, to gain power and kidnap children for use in satanic rituals. In this view of history, the deep state is really the driving force, and they are orchestrating historical events large and small. The Rothschilds go back to helping to finance the Napoleonic Wars. Post 1900, George Vanderbilt's home, built in 1889, was used for satanic child sacrifice rituals. Post 187, the deep state orchestrated the sinking of the Titanic. They were either responsible for, or at least used Hugh Hefner as a CIA operative to blackmail a wide variety of politicians and celebrities. The deep state is behind the JFK assassination and the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. They used the Freemasons to do false flag mass shootings. Basically every mass shooting that you've heard of is the work of the deep state cabal. The deep state used the CIA to orchestrate 9/11 as an inside job. They downed Saratov Airlines Flight 703 in 2018. They use Antifa for voter suppression and for starting the California wildfires. And basically every president between Reagan and Trump is part of the deep state. So the presidencies of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, as well as the entire Hillary Clinton campaign, part of the deep state. They also set fire to a building in Beijing which houses a Google office. The important thing here is that no historical event is too big or too small to be puppeteered by the deep state cabal. Another important post is in 3951, in which Q endorses the video Out of the Shadows as the, quote, best documentary of the year. Combined with the other pieces, this means that since before World War II, the deep state has been using the CIA to research mind control, tools, and techniques. The CIA then networked with Hollywood to manufacture trauma, in some cases inducing split personalities in otherwise healthy children. The deep state uses the CIA and Hollywood to control people to carry out their agenda of creating child-sacrificing satanic cults. The film makes clear that every pop star of a certain level of fame must be complicit in the satanic worship. This adds to the deep state roster all of the well-known pop stars such as Katy Perry and Lady Gaga. The film does add something interesting, in case you were thinking about giving up hope. The film posits that all Satanists have a compulsion to reveal themselves, and if you can follow all of the clues, then you can figure out how to find the Satanists who basically control everything that's happening in the world today, at least until Donald Trump became president. We'll continue with Donald Trump in round 2, but let's close out this section with a few clarifications. In post 2622, when asked if the Earth is flat, Q said no. In post 783, writing about John F. Kennedy, Q posted RIP JFK, we will succeed. Post 2611, when asked if JFK Jr. is alive, Q said no. Post 2225, when asked if we faked the moon landings, Q said no, the moon landings are real, although we have programs that exist outside of public knowledge. Maybe I'm wrong, but my inclination is to read these posts literally. The Earth is round, JFK is dead, JFK Jr. is also dead, and the moon landing was real. If you respectfully disagree and have more information to share, then by all means please write a comment below. So let's cap off round 1 with a quick summary of each side. For Karl Marx, history is about changes in production, how human beings produce the goods they need to survive. When the way we produce goods changes, there are massive changes in social relations and shifts in power. The most important shift for modernity came when innovations in trade, technology, and finance shifted power away from the old nobility, who controlled landed property, to the new class of capitalists, who control labor power. The modern world is going to be defined by the fundamental tension between capitalists, who control the means of production, and the workers, who sell their labor time. QAnon sees the driving force of history to be the cosmic fight of good versus evil, God versus Satan. For the last 150 years or so, the Satanists, possibly with the help of extraterrestrials, have been working overtime. They are behind nearly every major historical event and a wide variety of minor ones. They are deeply embedded in all government agencies, especially the CIA, who researches mind control tactics and shares the results with Hollywood to produce media to control people so that they can kidnap and traffic children for use in satanic rituals. Round 2. What's wrong with today? Karl Marx. Let's start with some Marxist Economics 101. You have two capitalists. Let's call one Marx and the other Engels. Marx makes blankets at a cost of $10 and sells them for $15. Engels innovates, figures out a way to make blankets at a cost of $9, and undercuts the competition by selling blankets for $14. Now this is good fundamental capitalism, right? This is how the system is supposed to work. Marx would agree that this is how capitalism works, that capitalism will make human beings more productive than they've ever been in history. But, over time, it will cause problems. Marx argues that behind these simple exchanges, there's a whole world of social relationships in place that are fundamentally unbalanced, and this imbalance will grow over time, leading to more and more tensions. So what are the problems? Let's go back to the simple example and ask, how did Engels get the cost of his blankets down from $10 to $9? Well, the first way is through the division of labor. In the past, workers used to follow every step in making a particular good. But with the division of labor, each worker only does one step in the process of making a finished good. As a result, a collective pool of workers are able to produce more goods together than they ever could as individuals. The only downside is that each worker feels like a cog in the machine, doing one boring, repetitive task day after day. Adam Smith wrote extensively about the power of the division of labor in his landmark book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. If you're like me and went to high school in the United States, then your history books probably portrayed Adam Smith as the ultimate cheerleader for free market capitalism, and Marx as the evil genius of communism. Maybe you even had multiple choice tests with questions like, who is considered the father of capitalism? A. George Washington, B. Adam Smith, C. David Ricardo, D. Elmer Fudd. And then right after it, you might have a question like, who wrote the Communist Manifesto? A. Karl Marx, B. Shoshana Zuboff, C. Thomas Paine, D. Bugs Bunny. Now, I have a real axe to grind with high school multiple choice tests for a variety of reasons. In this example, they leave you with the idea that Adam Smith and capitalism go in one history box, while Karl Marx and communism go in a completely different history box way over on the other side of the room. This dynamic completely overlooks Adam Smith's critiques of the division of labor and how Marx drew on Smith's work to critique capitalism. So in Capital, Volume 1, Marx quotes Adam Smith extensively about the negative impact that the division of labor will have on workers. Writing about how poor people are forced to do menial, repetitive tasks, Adam Smith states, quote, "The uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind. It corrupts even the activity of his body and renders him incapable of exerting his strength with vigor and perseverance in any other employments than that to which he has been bred. His dexterity at his own particular trade seems in this manner to be acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of the people, must necessarily fall." Adam Smith then goes on to differentiate between head labor, the more intellectually stimulating jobs that we might consider white-collar, versus the physical hand labor jobs that today we might consider blue-collar. Regarding the split between the two types of labor, Adam Smith writes, quote, "This division of labor, like every other, is an effect of past, and a cause of future progress. Ought the government then to work in opposition to this division of labor, and to hinder its natural course? Ought it to expend a part of the public money in the attempt to confound and blend together two classes of labor which are striving after division and separation?" That is Karl Marx in Capital Volume 1, quoting Adam Smith. This is a crucial dynamic for Marx. Skilled laborers who understand every step in producing a good are broken up into a collection of unskilled laborers who perform one monotonous task day in and day out. Marx hammers this point home a lot. Capital Volume 1, quote, "The habit of doing only one thing converts him into a never-failing instrument, while his connection with the whole mechanism compels him to work with the regularity of the parts of a machine." So the capitalist always wants to take the skilled labor of a craftsman and break it up into a group of people doing unskilled labor. Once he does that, the capitalist will try to replace the unskilled laborers with machines. Eventually, the machines come to dominate the production process. Capital Volume 1, quote, "In handicraft and manufacture, the workman makes use of a tool. In the factory, the machine makes use of him." This system works nicely for the capitalist, who can produce more goods to sell, but the worker is bored and increasingly put at a disadvantage in the job market. If the workers only do one thing all day, then they're not learning any new skills. Where an ancient Navajo knew every step in the process of hunting, fishing, and clothing themselves, a modern worker may only know how to sort shipments in an Amazon factory. Basically, move an item from point A to point B. Worse still, the modern worker lives under constant anxiety about the day Jeff Bezos will replace them with a machine that can do the same thing. To bring all of these concepts together, let's look at how Marx would explain something like the loss of jobs in the coal industry. In the early days, there were very few machines, and the mine owners relied heavily on workers. This gave the workers some amount of power to negotiate their salaries. As the workers toil away, though, the mine owners accumulate capital that they can reinvest into new tools and machines. As technology improves, each worker becomes more productive. This means fewer and fewer workers are needed, so the mine owners can start laying people off. This leads to a rise in unemployment. More technology and more unemployment mean the mine owners can start driving down wages. After all, if any worker tries to ask for a raise, then the mine owners can just fire them and hire somebody else. Workers get what they get, and they should be grateful to even have a job in the first place. Looking from 1950 to 2017, mining jobs drop 88%. During those same years, though, coal production only decreases by 33%. Coal mining just doesn't need human beings like it used to. For Karl Marx, automation is good in the sense that it increases productivity, but it becomes a major source of injustice towards the worker. Each miner spends all day working for a wage that they immediately have to spend on food and other necessities for their families. Once they finish eating the food, it's basically gone forever. In contrast, the mine owners continually benefit from the work of the miners. First, the owners sell the coal for a profit, then they use that money to start buying machines. The machines will continue to be a source of wealth for the owners, but not the workers. This is key to the divide between capitalist and worker. Marx doesn't hate capitalists because they're wealthy. Instead, he's making the point that these two groups of people make their livings in fundamentally different ways. The capitalist owns the means of production, while the worker sells their labor time. And Marx predicts that eventually, the capitalists are going to diverge from the workers. The wealthy will be able to accumulate capital at greater and greater rates, while the workers are going to spend their wages on basic needs, falling further and further behind. It just won't be possible for the workers to ever catch up to the wealthiest 1%. The part that really outrages Marx is the fact that the capitalists aren't using this accumulated capital to improve the lives of the workers. Going back to the coal mining example, at no point did the mine owners go to the workers and say, "Hey, thanks for your years of service that allowed us to buy all of these wonderful machines. Let's reinvest the profits earned from the machines into the healthcare and education of our workers and their families so that they can pursue other careers after this industry becomes either fully automated or irrelevant." That never happens. Instead, the workers are forced to compete against the machines that the workers made possible in the first place. And once the workers work themselves out of the job, they are discarded. You work until you're disposable. This is a big point for Marx. Capitalists are both job creators and unemployment creators. They start out as job creators, but then they take the profits from that labor and invest it into machines. Then the machines put the laborers out of work. This results in unemployment, which the capitalists can use as an excuse to drive down wages. Marx summarizes this dynamic in his 1847 lectures. Quote, "The more productive capital grows, the more the division of labor expands. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery expands, the more competition among workers expands, and the more their wages contract." So let's return to the example that started this round. We have two capitalists competing with each other. Marx makes blankets at $10 apiece and sells them at $15 apiece. To undercut the competition, Engels makes his blankets at $9 apiece and sells them at $14 apiece. Engels did this by using the division of labor and purchasing machines. Now, even if Marx wants to be a good guy and pay his employees a living wage, he can't. If Marx wants to compete in the marketplace, he's got to buy the same machines and drive down his employees' wages too. Nothing personal, it's just good business. Something else to note here, all of this innovation is driving overproduction. Now what do they mean by that? So let's think about Costco. I imagine everyone watching this has heard of Costco or a business like it, a store that lets you buy products at cheaper prices by buying in bulk. Instead of buying one box of tissues for $1.50, you buy 10 boxes of tissues at $1 each. So let's flip this around from the perspective of production. To sell goods at cheaper prices, you have to produce in bulk. No one invests in an assembly line to make one box of tissues. Costco has to produce millions of boxes to turn a profit. Capitalists need to produce in bulk if they want to sell in bulk. These dynamics are setting the stage for interrelated crises. On the one hand, capitalists are doing everything they can to keep wages as low as possible so they can maximize their own profits. On the other hand, the capitalists are trying to produce more and more goods. So the workers, even if they pull together all of their wages, will never be able to buy everything that they're making. So everyone in the Marx blanket factory is feeling agitated because the workers are barely scraping by. They spend all day producing blankets, but they're struggling to keep their families warm. In Capital Volume 1, quote, "Hence there is immanent in capital an inclination and constant tendency to heighten the productiveness of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and by such cheapening to cheapen the laborer himself." Now let's imagine that Engels comes up with a new idea. Engels realizes that he can move his factory overseas to Southeast Asia. There he can have Asian kids make blankets at $8 apiece. Then he can ship the blankets all over the world and sell them for $13 apiece. So Engels moves his factory overseas. Since his workers could never buy all of his blankets, Engels goes abroad in search of wealthy countries where he can sell his excess goods. He sells blankets in the United States, Europe, Australia, and all of the rich countries he can find. But of course, it's never enough. If Engels has a successful business, he's not just going to stop. He wants to keep growing and making more money. Capital Volume 1, quote, "The magnitude of profit whets his appetite for more profit." Plus, Marx will eventually figure out his new scheme and move his factory to Southeast Asia as well. So Engels has to be on the lookout for new ways to make money, mainly by finding new markets to sell his blankets. Let's imagine Engels takes out a big loan to push into a new market, maybe Brazil. Up until now, every one of Engels' ideas has paid off, so the bank grants Engels a big loan to help him break into Brazil. For the sake of this thought experiment, let's say that Engels' luck finally runs out. The blankets are a massive flop in Brazil. For whatever reason, Brazilians just hate these blankets. Sometimes businesses just fail. Engels is now in crisis. He needs the money from the blanket sales to pay back his loan from the bank. This was an especially bad problem in Marx's day because at that time banking regulations were incredibly loose and people didn't have insurance on deposits. For example, if you're currently living in the United States, your savings accounts are insured, so even if the bank gets robbed or goes under, your money is safe. You'll get it all back. But if Engels flops back in the day, then he won't be able to repay his loans to the bank. To continue this thought experiment, let's say he borrowed the money from the same bank where he pays his workers, meaning that all of his workers keep their money in this bank too. If the workers hear about the flop in Brazil, they could start to panic. What if the bank goes under? Rumors spread and all of a sudden there's a run on the bank. Do you remember the famous scene from It's a Wonderful Life? When the depression strikes, everyone is afraid that the building and loan will go bust and run out of money. So everyone in town runs to the building and loan and the bank to get as much of their money as they can before the bank goes under. This was a massive problem before the creation of FDIC insurance. In this simplified thought experiment, the blanket workers would all be rushing to their bank to withdraw as much money as possible out of fear that when Engels defaults on his loan, the bank is going to go bust. This is when Marx jumps in to say, wait a minute, this is madness. Why are the workers slaving away to make Engels rich? And why would the Brazilian blanket market ruin the lives of workers on the other side of the world? If the workers in the Engels factory need blankets, then the workers should just seize the factory, bake as many blankets as they need, and call it a day. Who cares if Engels won't make millions off of this new arrangement? The factory workers are the ones putting in the labor, and they're the ones who should reap the rewards. And so the workers seize the means of production and start making blankets for themselves. This is Marx's famous revolution. Round 2. What's wrong with today? QAnon. Picking up from round 1, QAnon would say that the problem with the world today is the deep state cabal who have infiltrated governments and legitimate businesses to control people's minds, kidnap children, and perform satanic rituals. And the control of the deep state is vast. I can't possibly cover the depth and breadth of the deep state in one video, so I'll just give you a taste of how massive the corruption extends. Prior to when Donald Trump and the wizards and warlocks started taking them on, the deep state were in charge of all manner of legitimate businesses by controlling the CEOs of Hudson's Bay, Ardent Leisure, Samsung, Tumblr, PepsiCo, Travel Centers of America, Papa John's Pizza, ESPN, Victoria's Secret, and the Burning Man Music Festival, just to name a few. In terms of rogue nation-states and terrorist organizations, the deep state controls North Korea, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and MS-13, among others. Regarding leading political figures and parties, the deep state controls the likes of Nancy Pelosi, John McCain, all or nearly all Democrats and Republicans in Congress who didn't seek re-election after Donald Trump came into office, the Queen of England, the royal family, Prime Minister Theresa May, Chancellor of Germany Angela Merkel, who may also be Adolf Hitler's granddaughter, French President Emmanuel Macron, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Pope/the Vatican, and the list goes on. They also used Mitt Romney to funnel money to Ann Coulter to turn her against Donald Trump, and I'm sure if you consult the secondary literature and videos, you'll find many, many more. The deep state's control of media companies is particularly vast. Please remember the CIA mind control program that the deep state shared with Hollywood and other media giants to wield their influence over the unsuspecting population. This means that the deep state has agents deeply embedded in ABC, AP, AURN, Bloomberg, BuzzFeed, CBS, CNBC, CNN, Daily Beast, GPG, Huffington Post, LA Times, McClatchy, MSNBC, National Journal, NBC, New Yorker, NPR, New York Post, New York Times, PBS, People, Politico, Reuters, Tina Brown, The Hill, Univision, Vice, Vox, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Yahoo. And let's not forget about how Hugh Hefner of Playboy magazine was a CIA agent who used children to lure prominent celebrities and politicians into compromising positions. The deep state also controls all of the major tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and Google. Facebook in particular was born out of a government program called the LifeLog Project to track everyone's movements and use data to enslave the population. And of course, Jeffrey Epstein was a linchpin to the deep state child trafficking operation. It's worth mentioning that the deep state control of Epstein and the media led to an entire scheme to use Disney Cruise Lines to traffic children to Epstein Island. We'll have more on Epstein later, but for now let's return to the original question. What's wrong with the world today? The answer is simple: Satan. Satan, who is basically evil for the sake of being evil, amassed an evil cabal of worshippers who also love being evil, and this cabal has been working overtime to gain control of almost everything in the world so they can carry out their demonic rituals. This must seem pretty hopeless. The deep state side of the chessboard controls almost everything, and they were going to solidify their satanic New World Order with the election of Hillary Clinton. The turning point came when a group of military leaders asked Donald Trump to run for president, and he shocked the establishment by winning. Donald Trump now leads the charge against the deep state. He has Q, either a person or a group, send coded messages to their supporters through 4chan, 8chan, and 8kun. Since then, Donald Trump has been winning battle after battle and just completely owning the deep state libs. Let's take a moment to consider some key points here. First, the importance of the United States military. QAnon is not just about supporting the troops. After all, any libtard can throw a "We support the troops" bumper sticker on the back of their car. Q is more about a spiritual devotion to the United States military as the tip of the spear in the cosmic fight of good versus evil. As Q writes in post 114, U.S. military equals savior of mankind. Q also reiterates ideas like, quote, humanity is at stake in several posts, including post 2298. The same can be said for Donald Trump. He's not just a president who people agree with because he represents their values. He is the leading chess master in the fight against the forces of Satan. Post 4 writes about Trump's win as wresting back power from the worldwide cabal of evil. Quote, this was a hostile takeover from an evil, corrupt network of players, not just Democrats. Under Trump's leadership, his closest allies are also rallying and winning fights. Post 67, quote, the Council of Wizards and Warlocks cannot be defeated. In particular, Trump seems to have allies in the NSA that he is using to fight against the evil CIA. This is alluded to in posts like 1380, quote, no such agency versus clowns in America. Trump's masterstroke, of course, being how he teamed up with Robert Mueller. The cover story was that Mueller was investigating Trump, but in reality, Mueller was working with Trump. You start to see this idea forming in post 2397, quote, Mueller designed to take in evidence needed to expose DS. Trump's major moves against the deep state are referred to as the storm, when hundreds of people will be arrested. This will also lead to a period called the Great Awakening, when all of the sheeple will come to realize that they've been lied to for years. In the meantime, Q likes to call on followers to vote and create memes to keep the president in power and spread the word of Q. Round 2. What's wrong with today? There's a lot of information in this round, so let's recap. Karl Marx. Marx is focused on the problems and divisions caused by the internal forces of capitalism. He doesn't think capitalists are evil per se. It's more of a fox and the hound situation where capitalists and workers are born into two separate roles that come into conflict with one another. The capitalists are forced to compete with each other, and in this competition they end up driving down wages, replacing workers with machines, and moving factories overseas. Meanwhile, the workers are forced into monotonous work that they absolutely hate, but they're afraid to complain because they need the money to survive. Eventually, things come to a head when the workers seize the factory and start producing goods for themselves instead of for the capitalists. Marx's ideas also rest on his theory of history. Much like tribal communities and medieval feudalism, capitalism is an economic system that serves a purpose for a time, but eventually it becomes increasingly imbalanced and gives way to something new. In the Grundrisse, he writes, the violent destruction of capital not by relations external to it, but rather as a condition of its self-preservation, is the most striking form in which advice is given to be gone and to give room to a higher state of social productions. QAnon basically takes the opposite approach. The movement has a deep and abiding love of Ronald Reagan and his economic policies of the 1980s. I also don't think it's any coincidence that Donald Trump, who was himself a symbol of 80s wealth, would eventually become the savior of the movement. From this point of view, capitalism is the best economic system we have and will always have. The real problem is that the free markets were hijacked by the forces of Satan. And it is the corrupting influence of these evildoers that is ruining capitalism for the rest of us. If Trump can just execute the demon worshippers who climb to the top of the economic system, then capitalism will start working right for the followers of Jesus. Round 3, Current Events. Now that we've laid the groundwork for both of these worldviews, we can start going through some of the most controversial issues of today. First, globalization. Why do businesses keep moving overseas? Why is there a Starbucks on every street corner in the world? And why can't anyone seem to reverse these trends? Marx would argue that this is a result of the internal forces of capitalism. Go back to the Engels blanket factory. One way to produce at a lower cost is to hire cheaper laborers. So let's say he owns a blanket factory in the United States where he has to pay workers at least $7.50 an hour. Then he realizes he can pay workers in Mexico $2.50 an hour to do the same work. Obviously, he'll want to move to Mexico, but here's the problem. To make the move worth it, he'll have to sell more goods. Remember, to sell in bulk, he has to produce in bulk. If he's worried that no one else will want to buy his blankets in the United States, then the next logical decision would be to sell blankets in Canada. There's only one problem: each country has different laws. If any one country wants to sabotage his profit margin, then all they have to do is just slap on a bunch of tariffs and taxes. What the factory owner, as a capitalist, really needs is an agreement between all three countries to allow free trade across North America. A North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. QAnon. QAnon sees globalization as completely separate from capitalism. After all, capitalism is perfect. That's never the problem. The real forces behind globalization are the satanic deep state cabal who are trying to make every country the same. Once they have removed national borders, they can take away everyone's guns and create a one-world government. They will then use the compliant sheeple to supply their satanic rituals. Up next, immigration. Immigration. QAnon. The QAnon movement is obviously pro-border wall and against immigrants. Immigrants are typically invaders who are destroying our shared cultural values. Also, MS-13 is a tool the deep state used to carry out assassinations and other dirty work. What's interesting here is that in the past, many establishment Republicans were pro-immigration. They actually wanted more immigrants coming into the country. In response, QAnon would say that these Republicans were part of the deep state and remind everyone that Donald Trump is also at war with major parts of the Republican establishment. In contrast, Karl Marx would argue that the older country club Republicans were just being good capitalists. Marx was always quick to point out that capitalists don't actually want full employment. When you have full employment, it gives a lot of bargaining power to workers who can, in turn, start arguing for raises and wages. So if you're a capitalist, you actually want there to be a pool of the unemployed. That way your workers feel lucky to have a job and can't start negotiating for raises. Immigrants also bring in more customers to buy various goods and services. Don't forget about how we need to produce in bulk. So immigrants actually solve two problems. They create the extra unemployment that allow capitalists to drive down wages, and they produce more consumers in an economy of overproduction. This also creates an interesting dynamic where the economy, at least on paper, grows significantly, but the lives of workers don't get any better. Up next is everyone's arch-nemesis, the Federal Reserve. Karl Marx. Take this with a grain of salt because Marx died in 1883, and the Federal Reserve wasn't established until 1913. Also, the Federal Reserve is a very complicated topic, deserving of an entire video in itself. If you like this one and want to see a video on the Federal Reserve, leave a comment below. Regardless, I feel pretty confident that Marx would dislike the Federal Reserve. Since Marx was focused on the internal problems with capitalism, the Federal Reserve basically exists to minimize some of those inherent flaws. The Federal Reserve uses its monetary policy to slow down the economy when it's getting too hot and heat up the economy when it's getting too cold. And yes, that can help smooth out economic growth. We certainly don't have banks going bust like they did in the 1800s. Ultimately, though, Marx would argue that it's a fool's errand. Bankers and investors are going to try to make as much money as possible in as short a time as possible. How do they do that? By making riskier and riskier investments. Now, the Federal Reserve and other banking regulations might try to make the U.S. financial sector a safe casino, but eventually investors will raise the table stakes, lower the bar for entry, and make bigger and bigger bets until the bubble bursts. And when the bubble bursts, it's the workers who are going to suffer. QAnon. Where Marx thinks that the Federal Reserve is used to paper over the flaws within capitalism, the QAnon movement sees the Federal Reserve as a perversion of capitalism. From this perspective, it's a tool of the deep state cabal, especially the Rothschilds, and it's used to screw over the hardworking people of the United States. It uses monetary policy to protect the interests of the big banks and wealthy elites of the deep state, especially when they're trying to mastermind false flag operations, crises, recessions, depressions, etc. Along with the Federal Reserve, one of the major tools in the deep state toolbox is the media. Monopolies and the media. QAnon. QAnon constantly asks the question, why has the media become so consolidated? The answer being that our media is the propaganda wing of the deep state Satan worshippers. In post 3369, the job of the media, 90% owned by 6 corporations, is not to inform the public of truth using facts, but to con the public using falsehoods and opinion to paint a narrative that is designed to keep the sheeple in line in order to maintain control and regain power. People awake and united ends their control. Brainwashing. Q reiterates the point time and time again. Once again, where Q argues that the deep state has broken capitalism, Marx argues that this is a key flaw within capitalism. And it doesn't just apply to the media, but just about every industry tends to be dominated by a handful of major companies after a while. Marx doesn't see this as a conspiracy by a few power players. Instead, technology and rising costs are the driving forces. Let's unpack this idea with a simplified look at the history of movies. So once upon a time, people like the Lumiere brothers could invent their own camera, shoot a bunch of random people going about their day, develop the footage, and show it in theaters. These short, silent films could draw sizable audiences, and they were at the cutting edge of movie making. Competition, however, inspires people to push the envelope. Soon, Georges Méliès starts adding special effects to his movies, and audiences start expecting to see effects. Runtimes also grow. People look forward to feature-length movies and not just shorts. In 1927, The Jazz Singer comes out and marks the new era of sound. Now audiences expect talking pictures. Color films become more and more prominent, first as fantasy or kids' movies, but eventually as serious films in themselves. Then, through the 1970s, we start to see the major summer blockbusters like Star Wars. At this point, it's increasingly ridiculous to think that a couple of French brothers could invent their own camera and make movies to compete with George Lucas. Filmmakers now need access to money for top-of-the-line cameras, special effects departments, professional actors, hair and makeup, musicians to score the soundtrack, insurance, and a million other things. This isn't because of a conspiracy for Marx, it's the result of technological innovations that gradually raise the amount of money and expertise you need to enter a business. In theory, any skilled craftsman with the blueprints to the Lumiere brothers' camera could make one and immediately go into the movie business back in the late 1800s. Nowadays, even if I give a skilled craftsman a professional camera for free, that guy would still be wildly unprepared to make the next summer blockbuster, or even a low-budget indie movie. So over time, the skyrocketing cost of movies means that fewer and fewer people can get into the movie business. The only people who can afford to compete are the people who are already entrenched in the industry. And since movies are so expensive to make, the big companies also want to drive out any competition because they can't afford to lose. Avengers Endgame was estimated to cost about $600 million to make. Can you imagine if that movie flopped? That said, this is not a straight rise in costs. It's more of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. New technology was invented to raise the bar for movie makers. Competition eventually drove down the price of that technology, at least a little bit, but then a new technology was invented to push the price back up again. However, this trend was complicated by digital computing, although the hidden costs of computing might be a topic for another video. Regardless, if you look at famous low-budget movies, you'll see some shocking price tags. Juno, $7.5 million, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, $5 million, The Purge, $3 million, Napoleon Dynamite, $400,000, and The Blair Witch Project up to $60,000. Keeping in mind that the whole reason Blair Witch got famous was because it tricked audiences into thinking that it was shot by some kids for no money at all. In reality, it may have cost up to $60,000 in 1999 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $93,000 in 2020. Because they were secretly hiring actors, shooting hours and hours of raw footage, and spending months editing the raw footage into the structure of a movie. Later, when Blair Witch was picked up by a distributor, the budget ballooned into the hundreds of thousands of dollars as they shot alternative endings and other things. Along with movies, let's talk about pop culture in general. Pop culture. Karl Marx. Marx would probably say pop culture is just a bunch of crap to distract workers from how miserable their lives are under capitalism. QAnon. Similarly, Q would say that pop culture is just a bunch of crap to distract people from how miserable their lives are under the deep state. However, Q would also add that sometimes pop culture can convey certain truths. I think this precedent started with Q's endorsement of Behold a Pale Horse, which floats the idea that Hollywood will sometimes slip true events into movies. Films like E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind might be loosely based on real interactions that we've had with extraterrestrials. As Q writes in post 3635, sometimes a good movie can provide a lot of truth and/or background, official secrets, relevant today, enjoy the show. In this vein, Q seems to say that there are harsh truths buried in pop culture. Post 1635, Q posts an image of Brand of Sacrifice with the caption, "You have now been marked with the brand of sacrifice. The lives of those who bear the brand, from the last drop of blood to the last moment of your agonizing death, will feed life to the new child of darkness." The Brand of Sacrifice is actually from the Berserk manga, written and illustrated by Kentaro Miura. I haven't actually read it myself, but it looks like a sweet manga. You can check it out here. Likewise, Q posts about the Jason Bourne series of books and movies, post 1638, with the implication that these are movie versions of things that may have really happened, Jason Bourne of course being a super-secret government assassin. Speaking of assassinations, let's get to the moment we've all been waiting for, Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. QAnon. For many in the QAnon movement, Jeffrey Epstein is proof of how the deep state has completely evaded the justice system of the United States and are using children for their evil satanic rituals. For Q, Epstein reads like an open and shut case, a slam dunk for the existence of an elite group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles, possibly in league with extraterrestrials, who have taken over all of the world's governments, businesses, and media organizations. Karl Marx. If Marx were alive, he'd almost certainly talk about Jeffrey Epstein, but as a continuation of his own outrage of how capitalists treat children. Marx wrote pages and pages about the horrors of child labor. Here's a passage from Capital, Volume 1. Mr. Broughton Charlton, county magistrate, declared as a chairman of a meeting held at the Assembly Rooms, Nottingham, on the 4th of January, 1860, quote, "There was an amount of privation and suffering among that portion of the population connected with the lace trade, unknown in other parts of the kingdom, indeed in the civilized world. Children of 9 or 10 years are dragged from their squalid beds at 2, 3, or 4 o'clock in the morning, and compelled to work for a bare subsistence until 10, 11, or 12 at night, their limbs wearing away, their frames dwindling, their faces whitening, and their humanity absolutely sinking into a stone-like torpor, utterly horrible to contemplate." For Marx, Satan has absolutely nothing to do with the lace trade. Capitalists just used children because their tiny bodies were dexterous. They could do work that adult bodies were too big for, especially when it came to climbing inside of industrial machines. The truly horrifying thing is that basically nothing has changed. That was the lace trade then, think of the clothing industry now. Every couple of years we hear about a scandal in which a major clothing brand is caught using child labor, and no one goes to jail, and nothing changes. Companies get away with child labor because it makes money, and why don't the kids being exploited for their labor ever take these companies to court? Well, that's easy, they don't have the money and resources to do so. And why didn't the kids being sexually abused speak out and take Epstein to court? Because they also don't have the money and the lawyers. There also happens to be severe social stigma for survivors of sexual abuse as well. If the legal system can't protect children from being exploited for their work, then why should we expect the same legal system to suddenly protect children from being exploited sexually? At the end of the day, the legal system is just there to protect the capitalist's ability to treat children like they're disposable. Marx would also argue that this goes for every bad behavior from a capitalist. In this case, Jeffrey Epstein was a pedophile. But the legal system would be equally incapable of stopping any random, terrible behavior from the ultra-wealthy. Just as a thought experiment, imagine if there was a billionaire who enjoyed torturing animals. Let's say every week he kidnaps and tortures 2 pets for no reason. Satan has absolutely nothing to do with it. And let's say every 20th pet he gets caught and has to pay someone $2,000 in exchange for them signing a non-disclosure agreement to shut them up. In 5 years, that billionaire will torture approximately 520 pets, get caught 26 times, and have to pay out $52,000, pocket change as far as he's concerned. And again, who's going to stop this guy? As long as he preys on poor people who can't afford to turn down $2,000, he can buy everyone's silence. With everyone silent, who would ever recognize his psychopathic pattern of behavior? Marx doesn't believe in a secretive evil group of people doing capitalism wrong. Instead, he argues that society is just doing capitalism. The problem is that over time, capitalism gives more and more power to a smaller and smaller group of people. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the result is a class of ultra-wealthy who are totally unconstrained by the legal system that is so oppressive to the poor. Conclusion. Well, that ends my side-by-side debate of Karl Marx and QAnon. As promised, I'm trying not to declare any winners. Instead, I'm curious to see your thoughts. Did I represent each thinker fairly, or did I make some mistakes along the way? Who do you think won or lost the debate? Leave your comments and suggestions below.